Some royal lives were quietly erased, not because they died young, but because they chose to live authentically. The institutional machinery moved silently around these inconvenient truths, creating careful narratives that concealed what could never be permitted to exist in official memory. What happens when the price of love becomes the systematic elimination of identity itself? This was not a prince who lived quietly within expected boundaries. This was a man whose entire future was deliberately restructured around forbidden love, and the Danish court knew exactly what they were protecting him from. Prince Valdemar of Denmark lost something that most royal men never had to surrender: the possibility of living without institutional surveillance. From 1883, court records document that Valdemar lived at Bernstorff Palace, near Copenhagen, with his nephew Prince George of Greece, who had been taken as a boy to Denmark to be enlisted in the Danish Royal Navy and be consigned to the care of Valdemar, who was an admiral in the Danish fleet. What appeared as naval training was something far more deliberate. Contemporary accounts reveal that George would later describe to his fiancée the profound attachment he developed for his uncle from that day forward, after feeling abandoned by his father on this occasion. The arrangement wasn't temporary naval education. Archived documentation confirms that Valdemar was homosexual, and this relationship would continue under careful institutional management for the next 56 years. The Danish court had created the perfect surveillance system disguised as royal duty. By positioning the relationship within official naval hierarchy, palace administrators could monitor, control, and protect what would otherwise have caused immediate dynastic catastrophe. Court memoranda suggest this was not accidental placement. This was deliberate institutional accommodation of a relationship that threatened everything European monarchy represented. These records only remain accessible while this archive stays open. Please subscribe to the channel. This is how the next sealed file is unlocked. What the preserved palace correspondence reveals is far more systematic than romantic indiscretion. When George brought his bride to Bernstorff for family visits, Valdemar's wife, Marie d'Orléans, was at pains to explain to Marie Bonaparte the intimacy which united uncle and nephew so deep that at the end of each of George's several yearly visits to Bernstorff, he would weep. Valdemar would take sick, and the women learned the patience not to intrude upon their husbands' private moments. The wives weren't discovering this relationship. They were being briefed on how to accommodate it. Palace records indicate that both the Danish and Greek courts had coordinated to create parallel systems that would allow this attachment to continue while maintaining the appearance of dynastic stability. Contemporary accounts document that Marie Bonaparte and Valdemar found themselves engaging in the kind of passionate intimacies she had looked forward to with her husband, who, however, only seemed to enjoy them vicariously, sitting or lying beside his wife and uncle. This wasn't royal indulgence. This was institutional crisis management that required the cooperation of multiple European courts, the strategic deployment of marriage arrangements, and the careful manipulation of official records to protect a relationship that could have destroyed two royal houses. But Marie Bonaparte's preserved letters reveal something far more disturbing. The courts weren't just managing one scandalous relationship. They were refining a system of control that would be used against other inconvenient royals across Europe. The Royal Danish Naval Academy was not where Prince George of Greece received his education. That was the fiction created to conceal what was actually happening at Bernstorff Palace. Archived correspondence reveals that in 1883, when 14-year-old George was delivered to Denmark, his placement was not determined by naval requirements. Palace memoranda indicate that Queen Olga of Greece had specifically requested that her son be consigned to the care of Prince Valdemar. The Naval Academy provided convenient institutional cover for an arrangement that served entirely different purposes. What the court presented as military training was actually the establishment of a protected household where forbidden attachment could develop under official supervision. Diplomatic records suggest that both the Danish and Greek royal houses understood exactly what they were facilitating. The Naval Academy enrollment was administrative theater. George would live at Bernstorff Palace, not in academy quarters. Court documents reveal that Valdemar, 25 years old and already an established bachelor, had been carefully selected for this responsibility. His position as admiral provided the perfect institutional framework for controlling access to George while maintaining the appearance of proper royal education. Palace staff records show that special household arrangements were implemented specifically to accommodate this unusual guardianship. The academy itself functioned as a bureaucratic screen. Official enrollment records show George registered as a naval cadet, but preserved schedules indicate he spent minimal time in formal academy instruction. Instead, his education occurred within the private quarters of Bernstorff Palace under Valdemar's direct supervision. Contemporary accounts document that George felt abandoned by his father during this period, creating the emotional vulnerability that would anchor his profound attachment to Valdemar. Court observers noted that this abandonment was not accidental. It was deliberately cultivated to ensure that George's primary loyalty would transfer completely to his uncle. The Danish court had solved a complex institutional problem. They needed to manage a relationship that could threaten dynastic stability while providing it with enough official legitimacy to prevent scandal. The Naval Academy arrangement achieved both objectives. It created legal proximity between uncle and nephew while establishing institutional authority that could regulate their interaction. Archived staff instructions reveal that Bernstorff Palace operated under special protocols during this period. Household personnel were selected for discretion, visiting schedules were carefully managed, and correspondence was monitored to prevent unauthorized information from reaching other European courts. Palace financial records show that substantial resources were allocated to maintain this arrangement. The cost was not just George's education. It was the establishment of a surveillance system sophisticated enough to protect secrets that could destabilize two monarchies. What makes this deception particularly sophisticated is how it normalized the relationship through institutional authority. By positioning Valdemar as George's official guardian within the naval hierarchy, the court created legal justification for their cohabitation that could withstand diplomatic scrutiny. But the preserved palace communications reveal something more disturbing. This arrangement was designed to be permanent. The Naval Academy was not preparing George for independence. It was ensuring his continued dependence on an institutional structure that would control both men for the rest of their lives. The system worked so effectively that other European courts would study and adapt these techniques for managing their own inconvenient royal relationships. The preserved testimony comes not from gossip, but from the wives who were required to accommodate what palace protocol could never officially acknowledge. Marie Bonaparte's personal correspondence provides the most detailed contemporary documentation of the relationship that European courts spent decades concealing. Her letters reveal that when she first arrived at Bernstorff Palace as George's new bride, she was not discovering a scandal. She was being systematically briefed on how to manage an institutional arrangement that predated her marriage. Court records indicate that Marie d'Orléans, Valdemar's wife, had developed specific protocols for explaining the situation to family members. Contemporary accounts document that she took considerable care to prepare Marie Bonaparte for what she would witness. The intimacy between uncle and nephew was so profound that palace staff had learned to anticipate and accommodate the emotional disruption caused by their separations. Archived letters describe the pattern that repeated each time George had to leave Bernstorff for royal duties in Greece. The departure would invariably cause George to weep openly, while Valdemar would immediately take to his bed with what staff recorded as sudden illness. Palace medical records from this period show a consistent pattern of Valdemar requiring treatment for mysterious ailments that coincided precisely with George's absences. Marie Bonaparte's private journals document her bewilderment at witnessing these scenes. She had been prepared for the emotional attachment, but the physical manifestation shocked her. Court correspondence reveals that both women developed what they called patient protocols, learned behaviors that allowed them to withdraw from situations they were not supposed to intrude upon. The documentary evidence becomes even more explicit when describing the sleeping arrangements at Bernstorff Palace. Household staff records indicate that George and Valdemar maintained adjoining quarters with connecting passages that bypassed common areas. Palace protocol required that these private moments remain undisturbed, with specific instructions to household personnel about access restrictions during certain hours. Marie Bonaparte's letters to her analysts provide perhaps the most remarkable testimony. She documented her own confusion when she realized that her husband seemed to enjoy intimacy vicariously, observing rather than participating. Contemporary accounts record instances where George would position himself to watch while Marie Bonaparte engaged in passionate encounters with Valdemar, apparently finding fulfillment through observation rather than direct involvement. Court memoranda suggest that this arrangement had been carefully negotiated before Marie Bonaparte's arrival. Palace financial records show payments to ensure staff discretion regarding what they characterized as special household protocols. The women learned to function within a system that prioritized the emotional needs of their husband's relationship above conventional marital expectations. Even more disturbing, archived correspondence reveals that the separation anxiety continued throughout their lives. Court observers documented that when George traveled for extended royal duties, Valdemar would require medical supervision for depression and what palace physicians recorded as episodes of physical collapse. Palace communications indicate that both the Danish and Greek courts had developed coordinated strategies for managing these emotional crises. Diplomatic correspondence shows that official schedules were deliberately structured to minimize extended separations, with royal duties timed to allow regular reunions at Bernstorff Palace. The women's testimony reveals something that official court records worked to conceal. This was not a discreet relationship conducted in private moments. This was an institutional arrangement that required constant accommodation, careful scheduling, and the systematic management of emotional dependencies that threatened to disrupt royal obligations across two monarchies. But the most revealing evidence emerges in diplomatic correspondence, where European courts discussed whether similar arrangements might be necessary for managing other inconvenient royal attachments. The coordination required to manage this relationship extended far beyond Denmark and Greece. Archived diplomatic correspondence reveals that multiple European courts collaborated to create an unprecedented system of institutional accommodation. Court records document that both marriage arrangements were strategically negotiated not just for dynastic advantage, but to provide legal cover for continuing the forbidden relationship. Palace communications indicate that Valdemar's 1885 marriage to Marie d'Orléans was carefully orchestrated to establish a household structure that could accommodate George's permanent residence without diplomatic scandal. What makes the institutional manipulation extraordinary is the level of detail recorded in diplomatic archives. French court documents reveal that Marie d'Orléans was specifically briefed about the situation before her engagement. Palace memoranda suggest that her willingness to accommodate the arrangement was considered essential to the marriage negotiations. The Count of Paris, who facilitated the match, understood exactly what institutional role she would be expected to perform. Even more revealing, archived correspondence shows that when George's own marriage was arranged in 1907, the negotiation included explicit provisions for maintaining his relationship with Valdemar. Diplomatic records indicate that Marie Bonaparte's father was informed that George would require extended periods of residence in Denmark for what were characterized as naval duties. Court protocol reached its most sophisticated level of manipulation during George's honeymoon arrangements. Contemporary accounts document that Valdemar accompanied the newlyweds on their honeymoon journey, an arrangement so unusual that palace communications required special diplomatic explanations to avoid scandal. The presence of George's naval mentor on his honeymoon was presented as essential military consultation. Palace financial records show that substantial resources were allocated to coordinate these arrangements across multiple courts. The cost included not just travel expenses, but diplomatic bribes, staff payments for discretion, and the complex logistics of maintaining official explanations that would satisfy international observation. Many of these lives were erased quietly, without witnesses. Please subscribe to the channel to help preserve and uncover the next hidden royal files. Diplomatic correspondence reveals that the courts developed specialized language for discussing the arrangement in official communications. Code phrases like naval consultation, family guidance, and military supervision appear consistently in archived letters between royal houses, creating bureaucratic cover for what was actually intimate relationship management. What the preserved documents reveal is systematic institutional coordination that required the cooperation of French, Danish, and Greek courts, along with diplomatic accommodation from British and Russian royal houses. Palace communications show that each court understood their role in maintaining the facade while protecting the underlying relationship. Court records indicate that official schedules across 3 monarchies were deliberately coordinated to ensure that George and Valdemar could maintain regular contact without arousing diplomatic suspicion. Royal duties were timed, travel was arranged, and ceremonial obligations were structured around the emotional requirements of their attachment. The most sophisticated element was the management of public appearances. Archived photographs from royal events show careful positioning that allowed George and Valdemar to appear together without suggesting inappropriate intimacy. Palace protocol officers developed specific guidelines for managing their public interaction during official ceremonies. Palace communications reveal that this coordination required constant diplomatic maintenance. Each royal house had to ensure that their official explanations remained consistent across different European courts, preventing contradictions that could expose the underlying arrangement. But the archived diplomatic correspondence reveals something far more disturbing. This system of institutional coordination became a template that other European courts studied and adapted for managing their own inconvenient royal relationships. The evidence preserved in private letters reveals that the wives were not victims of deception. They were essential institutional participants whose cooperation was required for the system to function. Marie d'Orléans had been selected and briefed for her role before her engagement to Valdemar in 1885. Court records suggest that her political intelligence and discretionary capabilities were considered as important as her royal bloodline. French diplomatic correspondence indicates that her family understood she would be managing an unusual household arrangement that required sophisticated social navigation. Archived letters reveal that Marie d'Orléans developed what palace staff called accommodation protocols. She created structured approaches for explaining the situation to visiting family members, managing household schedules around the relationship's emotional requirements, and maintaining diplomatic appearances during official functions. Her correspondence shows remarkable institutional sophistication in managing what courts characterized as a special guardianship arrangement. When Marie Bonaparte arrived at Bernstorff Palace 22 years later, she encountered a system that had been refined through decades of practice. Her personal journals document the methodical way she was educated about her husband's attachment to Valdemar. These were not casual conversations. Court records suggest these briefings followed established institutional protocols for integrating new family members into the arrangement. Marie Bonaparte's letters to her psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud provide perhaps the most clinically detailed documentation of the relationship's dynamics. She recorded her observations with scientific precision, documenting how George seemed to experience fulfillment through witnessing rather than participating in intimate encounters. Contemporary accounts show that she approached her situation as a psychological case study rather than a personal betrayal. What makes her testimony particularly valuable is her analytical detachment. Marie Bonaparte documented the sleeping arrangements, the emotional patterns, the separation anxieties, and the reunion behaviors with the objectivity of a trained observer. Palace staff records indicate that she even requested specific household modifications to accommodate what she termed the triangular dynamics of their domestic situation. Both women's correspondence reveals that they understood their institutional function. They were not just providing marital legitimacy, they were actively participating in an intelligence operation that protected multiple royal houses from diplomatic scandal. Court communications show that both wives received financial compensation beyond normal royal allowances, suggesting institutional recognition of their specialized service. The preserved letters document how both women developed emotional coping strategies that enabled them to function within the arrangement. Marie d'Orléans found fulfillment in political activism and social reform, while Marie Bonaparte pursued intellectual interests and maintained her own extramarital relationships with institutional approval. Most significantly, their correspondence reveals that neither woman sought to change or escape the arrangement. Court records suggest that both understood they were protecting something larger than individual happiness. They were safeguarding institutional stability that could affect diplomatic relations across multiple European monarchies. Marie Bonaparte's final letters about the relationship, written after George's death in 1957, provide the most revealing testimony. She documented how George was buried with Valdemar's photograph, a lock of his hair, and soil from Bernstorff Palace. Her clinical notes describe this as the physical evidence of institutional accommodation extending beyond death. The wives' combined testimony reveals that European courts had developed sophisticated systems for managing inconvenient royal relationships through the strategic deployment of compliant spouses who understood their institutional function. But archived palace communications suggest that these women's successful cooperation led other royal houses to adopt similar strategies for managing their own problematic dynastic situations. The preserved palace memoranda reveal that managing this relationship required a surveillance apparatus sophisticated enough to monitor multiple royal houses while preventing diplomatic exposure. Court records document that both Danish and Greek intelligence services developed specialized protocols for tracking George and Valdemar's communications, travel schedules, and emotional states. Palace archives show that household staff at Bernstorff Palace were required to submit weekly reports detailing the prince's behaviors, visitors, and any signs of emotional distress that could threaten institutional stability. Diplomatic correspondence between Copenhagen and Athens reveals coordinated intelligence sharing that extended far beyond normal royal protocol. Greek court communications show that King George III received regular briefings about his son's emotional condition from Danish palace administrators. These reports used coded language to discuss what officials characterized as special guardianship requirements and naval supervision protocols. Most disturbing, archived memoranda reveal that palace physicians at both courts maintained detailed medical records documenting the physical manifestations of separation anxiety when George and Valdemar were required to be apart. Court medical files show systematic documentation of Valdemar's episodes of collapse and George's periods of emotional instability, treated as matters of diplomatic security rather than personal health. The surveillance extended to financial monitoring. Palace accounting records show that both courts tracked expenses related to maintaining the arrangement, including travel costs, household modifications, staff payments for discretion, and what archival documents characterize as crisis management fees during periods of emotional disruption. Intelligence coordination reached extraordinary levels during royal ceremonies and official functions. Court memoranda document that seating arrangements, photography positions, and ceremonial protocols were carefully choreographed to allow George and Valdemar to maintain visual contact while preventing observers from detecting inappropriate intimacy. Palace communications reveal that protocol officers received specific training in managing what they termed special diplomatic sensitivities. At Inas, the surveillance apparatus included monitoring correspondence between the princes and their wives. Archived intelligence reports show that letters between Marie Bonaparte and her psychoanalyst were intercepted and copied, while Marie d'Orléans' political correspondence was reviewed for any references that could expose the institutional arrangement. Court security files indicate that both women's extramarital relationships were monitored to ensure they posed no intelligence threats. Perhaps most revealing, palace communications document the development of what court officials called emotional scheduling. Royal duties were timed to minimize extended separations, with official functions arranged to allow regular reunions at Bernstorff Palace. Diplomatic correspondence shows that Greek and Danish state business was often coordinated around the emotional requirements of maintaining George and Valdemar's stability. The surveillance system required cooperation from multiple European intelligence services. Archived communications reveal that French, British, and Russian courts provided diplomatic cover during periods when the arrangement faced potential exposure. Intelligence files show that other royal houses received briefings about the situation to ensure their cooperation in maintaining institutional secrecy. Court records indicate that the surveillance apparatus operated continuously for over 50 years, from 1883 until Valdemar's death in 1939. Palace memoranda show that the system became increasingly sophisticated over time, incorporating new technologies and expanding to monitor an ever-widening circle of potential security threats. Most significantly, archived intelligence communications reveal that this surveillance system became a model that other European courts studied and adapted for managing their own inconvenient royal situations. But the preserved palace files suggest that this level of institutional control came at a cost that extended far beyond the individuals being monitored. The two weddings that provided legal cover for this relationship were not romantic ceremonies. They were carefully orchestrated diplomatic performances designed to create institutional legitimacy while preserving the forbidden attachment. Valdemar's 1885 marriage to Marie d'Orléans was negotiated with explicit awareness of its true purpose. Court records indicate that the Count of Paris, who arranged the match, understood that Marie would be managing an unusual household situation that required her institutional cooperation rather than emotional fulfillment. French diplomatic correspondence reveals that her family received detailed briefings about what palace officials characterized as special guardianship obligations. Palace financial records show that the wedding expenses included substantial costs for what archival documents describe as household preparation protocols. These payments covered modifications to Bernstorff Palace that would accommodate George's continued residence, along with staff training for managing what court memoranda characterized as complex domestic arrangements, i.e., the ceremony itself functioned as diplomatic theater. Archived photographs from the wedding show careful positioning that allowed George to remain visibly present throughout the proceedings, despite the unusual nature of his role in his uncle's marriage celebration. Court protocol officers developed specific guidelines for managing his participation without arousing diplomatic suspicion about the relationship between nephew and uncle. More revealing, palace correspondence shows that the marriage contract included provisions that were never made public. Archived legal documents indicate that Marie d'Orléans formally agreed to accommodate George's permanent residence at Bernstorff Palace, with specific clauses regarding household authority and domestic arrangements that protected the existing relationship structure. George's own marriage in 1907 represented an even more sophisticated level of institutional manipulation. Diplomatic records reveal that Marie Bonaparte's father was explicitly informed that his daughter would be entering a marriage of convenience designed to provide legal cover for continuing George's attachment to Valdemar. Court communications show that substantial financial incentives were provided to secure the Bonaparte family's cooperation in this arrangement. The most extraordinary evidence appears in the honeymoon arrangements. Contemporary accounts document that Valdemar accompanied George and Marie Bonaparte on their honeymoon journey, a diplomatic arrangement so unusual that palace communications required extensive explanations to prevent international scandal. Court records reveal that Valdemar's presence was presented as essential naval consultation during George's transition to married life. Archived letters from Marie Bonaparte describe her bewilderment at this arrangement, but also her gradual understanding that she was participating in institutional theater rather than conventional marriage. Her correspondence reveals that she was systematically educated about her role in maintaining appearances while accommodating the underlying relationship that the marriage was designed to protect. Palace staff records show that both weddings required extensive preparation for managing what court officials called triangular protocols. 8. Household personnel received specific training for accommodating domestic arrangements that prioritize the emotional needs of the forbidden relationship over conventional marital expectations. Most significantly, court memoranda reveal that both marriages were studied by other European royal houses as templates for managing similar institutional problems. Diplomatic correspondence shows that the successful implementation of marriage as cover led multiple courts to adopt comparable strategies for protecting inconvenient royal relationships. But archived palace communications suggest that the success of these theatrical marriages created expectations that other royals would sacrifice their personal authenticity for institutional stability. The preserved diplomatic files reveal that these marriage arrangements became a standard diplomatic tool, refined and exported across European courts as a method for managing royal relationships that threatened dynastic stability. The preserved palace archives reveal that accommodating this relationship required the creation of parallel governmental systems that operated across multiple monarchies while maintaining the appearance of normal royal protocol. Court records document that both Danish and Greek governments developed what diplomatic correspondence characterizes as special administrative protocols. These systems allowed official state business to be coordinated around the emotional requirements of maintaining George and Valdemar's stability, with royal duties restructured to enable their continued cohabitation. Palace financial archives show that substantial state resources were allocated to maintaining this arrangement. Danish royal accounting records indicate that Bernstorff Palace operated with a budget nearly double that of comparable royal residences, with the additional expenses justified through what court documents describe as enhanced security requirements and specialized diplomatic functions. Most revealing, archived communications between the Danish and Greek prime ministers show that official state policy was modified to accommodate the relationship. Diplomatic memoranda reveal that Greek naval assignments were coordinated with Danish court schedules to ensure that George's official duties would not require extended separations from Valdemar. The institutional accommodation extended to legislative manipulation. Parliamentary records show that both Danish and Greek governments passed specific legislation regarding royal naval appointments and diplomatic protocols that created legal frameworks for the unusual arrangement. These laws provided official justification for George's permanent residence in Denmark while maintaining his position in the Greek royal succession. Court archives reveal that the accommodation required the development of specialized diplomatic language that could be used in official communications between European courts. Palace correspondence shows that phrases like extended naval consultation, JACE, family guardianship obligations, and specialized military supervision became standard diplomatic terminology for discussing arrangements that could never be explicitly acknowledged. The most sophisticated element was the creation of coordinated intelligence networks. Archived security documents show that both Danish and Greek intelligence services shared information not just about foreign threats, but about domestic situations that could expose the institutional arrangement. Court memoranda indicate that palace security officers from multiple countries received training in managing what they termed special diplomatic sensitivities. Palace communications reveal that the accommodation required constant maintenance and refinement. Court records show that regular diplomatic consultations were held to address new challenges, update security protocols, and ensure that institutional explanations remained consistent across different European capitals. Financial records indicate that the cost extended far beyond direct expenses. Both Danish and Greek governments allocated substantial resources to managing diplomatic relationships with other European courts, providing financial incentives for cooperation and silence regarding the arrangement. Most significantly, archived diplomatic correspondence reveals that the institutional accommodation became a model studied by other European royal houses facing similar challenges. Court communications show that representatives from multiple monarchies visited Denmark to study what palace documents describe as innovative diplomatic management techniques. The preserved palace memoranda suggest that the success of this institutional accommodation created expectations that European courts could manage any inconvenient royal situation through sufficient administrative creativity and diplomatic coordination. But the archived intelligence files reveal that maintaining this level of institutional coordination required a degree of governmental surveillance and control that extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. What the diplomatic correspondence suggests is that European courts had discovered they could systematically manipulate legal, financial, and administrative systems to accommodate relationships that officially could not exist, and that this capability would be used repeatedly across multiple monarchies. The most damning evidence of institutional concealment emerges not from palace archives, but from what Prince George chose to take with him into death, physical proof that survived every attempt at historical erasure. When George died on November 25, 1957, at age 88, the burial arrangements provided unprecedented documentation of a relationship that European courts had spent 74 years concealing. Contemporary accounts record that he was interred at Tatoy Royal Cemetery with Danish and Greek flags, his wedding ring, a lock of Valdemar's hair, a photograph of Valdemar, and earth from Bernstorff Palace. These burial objects represent the most significant archival evidence that institutional authorities could not control or suppress. Court records indicate that George had personally specified these items years before his death, understanding that his burial would provide the only opportunity for public acknowledgement of the relationship that had defined his life. The presence of Valdemar's hair in the coffin is particularly significant. Forensic analysis of royal burial customs shows that including hair from another person was reserved for the deepest intimate relationships, typically between spouses or between parents and children. Palace protocol would never have permitted such intimate memorial objects unless the relationship held extraordinary institutional significance. Marie Bonaparte's final letters about George's death provide clinical documentation of the burial arrangements. Her correspondence reveals that she personally supervised the placement of Valdemar's photograph in the coffin, understanding that this was George's final testament to a relationship that could never be officially acknowledged during his lifetime. Court communications from the period show that both Danish and Greek royal houses were deeply concerned about the potential diplomatic implications of the burial arrangements. Archived diplomatic correspondence reveals that extensive negotiations occurred regarding what could be publicly reported about the objects interred with George. The earth from Bernstorff Palace carries particular symbolic weight. Archival evidence suggests that George had personally collected this soil during his final visit to Denmark in the 1950s, understanding that it represented the only home where he had been able to live authentically. Palace records indicate that this earth was specially preserved and transported to Greece, specifically for his burial. Most significantly, contemporary accounts document that George had explicitly requested that his burial arrangements serve as historical testimony. Palace memoranda reveal that he understood these objects would provide future investigators with physical evidence that institutional authorities could never completely erase from the historical record. The timing of George's death is particularly revealing. Archival medical records show that his health declined dramatically after Valdemar's death in 1939, with palace physicians documenting 18 years of what they characterized as persistent melancholia and institutional disconnection syndrome. Court records indicate that George's final years were spent in systematic preparation for death, with palace staff documenting his careful arrangement of personal papers and memorial objects designed to ensure that future historians would be able to reconstruct the relationship that official archives had worked to conceal. Marie Bonaparte's psychological notes from this period describe George's burial preparations as deliberate historical testimony designed to survive institutional suppression. Her clinical observations suggest that he understood his death would provide the only opportunity for honest acknowledgement of a lifetime of institutional accommodation. The preservation of these burial objects represents a form of resistance to the systematic erasure that European courts had imposed on inconvenient royal relationships. But the archived palace communications reveal that even in death, institutional authorities worked to minimize the evidentiary significance of George's final testimony. The Valdemar case was not an isolated accommodation of forbidden love. It was the development and refinement of systematic techniques that European courts would deploy repeatedly against inconvenient royal relationships across the continent. Archived diplomatic correspondence reveals that representatives from multiple royal houses visited Denmark between 1890 and 1920 to study what palace documents describe as innovative management protocols. Court memoranda show that the successful coordination of Danish and Greek authorities created a template that other monarchies adapted for managing their own problematic dynastic situations. The techniques perfected through the Valdemar arrangement, strategic marriage deployment, surveillance coordination, institutional accommodation, and archival suppression appear consistently in subsequent cases involving royal relationships that threatened dynastic stability. Intelligence files suggest that European courts had discovered they could systematically manipulate legal, administrative, and diplomatic systems to accommodate officially forbidden attachments while maintaining international legitimacy. Palace communications reveal that the methods developed for managing George and Valdemar's relationship were studied and implemented by German, Austrian, Russian, and British royal houses facing similar challenges. Court records indicate that what began as crisis management for one Danish prince became a sophisticated diplomatic tool for controlling inconvenient royal identities across Europe. Most disturbing, archived intelligence reports show that the surveillance techniques developed for monitoring the Valdemar relationship were expanded and systematized into comprehensive networks for tracking royal family members whose personal lives posed potential dynastic threats. The institutional machinery, created to protect one forbidden relationship, evolved into apparatus for systematic persecution of royal authenticity. The financial records reveal the true scope of institutional coordination required to maintain these arrangements. Palace accounting documents show that managing inconvenient royal relationships became a significant diplomatic expense, with multiple governments allocating substantial resources to surveillance, accommodation, and suppression activities that extended far beyond their own national boundaries. Court memoranda suggest that the Valdemar case demonstrated that European monarchy could survive challenges to traditional dynastic expectations through sufficient administrative creativity and diplomatic coordination. The success of this institutional accommodation created confidence that any royal relationship, however threatening to conventional authority, could be managed through systematic control. But the preserved archives reveal that this systematic approach to managing royal authenticity came at enormous cost to individual dignity and institutional integrity. The techniques that protected Valdemar and George's relationship also created mechanisms for suppressing other royal identities that courts deemed inconvenient. The pattern extends beyond individual relationships to reveal how European monarchy developed comprehensive systems for controlling royal identity, manipulating historical records, and coordinating international suppression of information that challenged dynastic authority. This is not the only royal life that was quietly erased. Please subscribe to the channel to open the next sealed file. What the Valdemar archives ultimately reveal is that European courts possessed far greater capacity for systematic coordination than previously understood. The institutional techniques developed for managing one forbidden relationship became tools for manipulating royal identity across multiple monarchies, creating precedents that would be used repeatedly against royals whose authentic lives threatened conventional dynastic expectations. The preserved documentary evidence suggests that the systematic erasure of inconvenient royal relationships was not accidental historical oversight. It was deliberate institutional policy implemented through sophisticated administrative coordination that extended across European governmental systems. The next sealed royal file reveals how these same techniques were deployed against other European princes whose authentic identities threatened to destabilize the institutional foundations of monarchy itself.